Alrighty, welcome to the first Center for Evolution in Medicine seminar of 2021. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Kathleen Reinhardt, who's an electrophysiologist and anthropologist at the University of Calgary in Canada. She earned her BA at Stony Brook and her PhD in 2020 at a small school in England called Oxford or something like that. Her research stands at the intersection of ecology, evolution, and physiology, particular focus on topics of sleep and circadian rhythms. She's examining the interrelationships between environmental factors, physical activity levels, and sleep patterns of humans living lifestyles ranging across different moments of industrialization to understand the evolutionary links between sleep and culture, as well as its role in modern human health. Her research is quite interdisciplinary, I guess you would be proud. And she's both in the Human Evolutionary Energetics Lab in the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology, as well as the Chronobiology Lab in the Department of Psychology. She's a key member of the Orang Asli Health and Life Ways project in Malaysia, which is a large-scale health and life history project working with multiple populations across Malaysia. In addition to her high-quality research, she's also an accomplished scientific illustrator, has a number of art collaborations, many of them are available on her website. Beyond science and art, she's also an avid winter sports enthusiast with lots of cross-country skiing and ice climbing. And, while we might be complaining about the weather, currently 51 degrees Fahrenheit here in Tempe, she flies back to Calgary tonight, and it's going to be minus 33 when she lands. Oh. So it couldn't be worse. Without any further ado, thank you so much. And
thank you, Ben, for a very broad introduction. That was great. I don't have to introduce anything. It's really nice to be here in Arizona. As I mentioned, a really nice temperature break as well for me, though it'll be a shock to go back. And I'm going to talk broadly about my research on non-human primate sleep, going towards my current research, which is investigating sleep in humans. Oh, no. There we go. Okay, so overall, my research, as I mentioned, is quite a broad phylogenetic scope. So I began looking at just non-human primates, and then those questions led me to having a lot of questions about human sleep. Largely, this considers an evolutionary framework, considering behavioral ecology and also evolutionary mismatch, and seeing how the ecology actually drives our circadian rhythms and other biological rhythms, and how this can inform the evolution of human sleep. So for today's talk, I'll break it up into two parts. Pretty directly, going first, I'll talk about non-human primates and behavioral plasticity and something called sleep regulation, which I'll explain in a little bit, in structurines, going from slow lorises to lemurs. And then I'll talk about my research with humans and looking at transitions in lifestyles and how we look at sleep in small-scale societies. So sleep is very fundamental for various aspects, specifically different cognitive performances and also physiological functions. So it plays a huge role in health pretty directly, and it's very intertwined with the environment. So if we consider sleep from an ecological perspective, there are two processes that are happening. So it is both intrinsically driven and is also entrained by our environment. So we have something called sleep homeostasis, which I'll explain, which is the natural function of sleep that happens. And then also our environment, different aspects of it, will train it every day to optimize timing of different behaviors. So in primates and other animals, so we have two different main aspects of sleep and timing. So the top one here is something called polyphasic sleep, and the bottom here is monophasic sleep. Polyphasic sleep is an ancestral trait in mammals, so it's something you see in rodents a lot, and this means that sleep occurs at various bouts throughout the 24-hour period. And then monophasic sleep is when sleep occurs in one single period across the 24-hour period. So much like what we do, something that's a lot more familiar to us. You can also think of cats for polyphasic sleep. And within a single sleep bout, we go through various stages of sleep that also play a huge role in cognition and memory consolidation. And this figure here on the right shows what's about a single night of monophasic sleep. And with each bout going up is what's called a sleep bout within that period. And the dark parts are the REM sleep that occurs in each sleep bout. So what happens is when you go to sleep, as the night progresses, your REM sleep actually gets longer towards the end of your sleep. So if you're a polyphasic sleeper, you're not going to get as much REM sleep as if you're a monophasic sleeper, because you're not going to progress in time towards that elongated REM sleep. And this has a lot of implications for the evolution of human sleep. So this is one of the reasons why we think monophasic sleep is something we see in humans. And REM sleep plays a huge role, again, in cognitive functions. Now, there's a problem with taking images sometimes from the internet. I realize there's a very weird typo for tarsiers there. But if we look at primates, there are a couple of different ideas about where monophasic sleep derived. And the first being that monophasic sleep derived at the base of the primate order. And then the second being that perhaps there's a reversal trait that happens with lemurs in considering the cathemeral primates. Let me just add a little more about cathemeral primates here. So for those who don't know, cathemerality is a behavioral and activity pattern where the different behavioral proportions are equal between the light photoperiod and the dark photoperiod. So meaning that if you're feeding during the day, you're also feeding a same proportion of your time in the night. And this is only seen in lemurs. So lemurs are quite unique in that we have the three different activity patterns between nocturnal, diurnal, and also cathemeral. And this is why we think perhaps they might have polyphasic sleep, but I'll get a little bit more into that with their research as well. And in terms of what I mentioned earlier about the intrinsic sleep patterns, so because sleep is so essential, it's also quite a costly behavior, but this is how we know that it's important, because when you're asleep, you're more prone to things like predation and fluctuations in your environment. But if we consider sleep regulation, so your circadian rhythms being the bottom black line here, this goes every day, pretty periodic. However, there's something else that happens with their sleep called sleep homeostasis. And chronobiology has a lot of jargon, and unfortunately some of that jargon is the same thing. Usually happens when multiple people are studying similar topics and they all want to make a name for this process. So we have three different names: sleep regulation, sleep drive, and also sleep homeostasis. I'll use sleep homeostasis throughout just because of my training. So when we go to sleep at night, your pressure for sleep need drops. So when you wake up in the morning, and it's this blue line here, your sleep need is at its lowest. So you're not going to nap in the morning, for example. You're not going to feel tired in the morning. And this is part of the circadian process and intrinsic driving. As your day goes on, that pressure is going to accumulate. Now, if you surpass a certain threshold and we go into the red and you keep staying awake, that pressure is going to accumulate so much that you go into what's called sleep deprivation, and then it's going to drop. So this is called sleep homeostasis, and it regulates our sleep patterns in this aspect.
Sorry, are you saying that the need for sleep goes down at some point if you're sleep deprived?
When you go to sleep, the need for sleep drops. Yeah. It's, when you think about it, it's like, right, I can understand that. If I get tired at the end of the day, that's when we go to bed. And there are a lot of other drivers as well. But you will still feel this even if you had no environmental drivers. But we need the environment to entrain these patterns, in addition to this, to keep us from experiencing things like sleep deprivation. Okay. So going on to those drivers, we have some key aspects which we call timekeepers. And these are light, temperature, activity patterns, timing of feeding, and social interactions are the strongest. Light in particular is one that I'll be focusing on a lot today. And basically what happens is in the transitions of light between the light and dark photoperiods, this is received through the ganglion cells of the eyes, and it communicates through to where that little clock is something called the SEN, which is a suprachiasmatic nucleus. And this communicates to the pineal gland to reduce melatonin to tell us, okay, it's time to go to bed. And this is very much the largest driver of our activity patterns. And this is where chronobiology really comes in to understanding these evolutionary pathways. And there are so many other aspects of sleep that respond to this. So this impacts our metabolism, it can impact stress and hormone levels, and also it cues when different behaviors should be performed. Now, bringing back to primates, thinking about the evolution of human sleep, there's a lot of research that's done, particularly Charlie Nunn has done a lot of the phylogeny research on this, and generally they found that diurnal primates are sleeping for about 8 to 11 hours, and then nocturnal are sleeping from 13 to 17 hours. Now, unfortunately, these are all done on captive populations. So if you're thinking of being in captivity, you're not actually exposed to environmental fluctuations. You're going to have ad libitum food. You're going to be buffered from any environmental shifts, and there's controlled lighting going on. There's also no predation. So these animals are very flexible, and they can sleep a lot more. So there's only a few wild primate sleep studies that have been done. And again, I'll be talking about those today. And there's still this idea that perhaps there's monophasic and polyphasic sleep in lemurs. And there's also a bit of an oddity going on too with the sleep range of up to 17 hours, which if you think about it is a lot of time. That means you have like no time for feeding and socializing. So for primates, it seems pretty unreasonable. And these are called marathon sleepers. Now, the interesting thing about marathon sleepers is that they're all species that use torpor. And if you're just doing behavioral observations, torpor could be confused as sleep. And sorry for throwing out jargon in there, but for those who don't know, torpor is metabolic reduction. If you think of hibernation, this is more of a daily form of hibernation. So you don't actually accumulate sleep during torpor, but it could be confused as torpor. So some of the methods I'm going to talk about with my research today, mainly I work with accelerometry and use that to determine the likeliness of an individual being asleep or not. I also validate with behavioral observations for primates and use a combination of skin temperature and thermal camera imaging, radiotelemetry for individual identification, and then, of course, climate monitoring, because I mentioned temperature has impacts as well, and phenology, because we're also interested in the timing of feeding around seasonal variations. The videography is something we were starting to get into, not positive now if we're going to do or not, but using videography to distinguish sleep in captive populations. Okay. So first I'll talk about my research on slow lorises, and this research was done with the Little Fireface Project, and particularly with a population in what's called an agroforest environment. So if you see all these patches here, there's a lot of farms that are in between plots of bamboo and different trees here. And slow lorises are an interesting species to work with because being near the equator, they have more variation daily in their temperatures than they do throughout the year. And they're also, in this area, there aren't that many predators except for birds of prey. And they are seasonal in terms of their diet. So there is gum that they eat seasonally and also nectar. But also, they use torpor. I realize this is a weird, it's hard to find an image of torpor, it's just an animal sat there. So this is an example of a torpor bout. And as I mentioned earlier, torpor is not sleep. So the fact that an animal is taking that time to use torpor, it's an energy conservation method, it actually can be a good variable to look at sleep homeostasis, because you can see if an animal is accumulating for sleep loss around torpor. Yeah.
What are on the axes here?
Sorry, yeah, not the best image. So this is time, and this is temperature, body temperature, or skin temperature in this case. And you can look at the duration of time that the skin temperature is below a certain threshold, and that's how we define torpor. Okay, so for the lorises, our main objective was to figure out basically what the environmental drivers of their sleep were. And we hypothesized that they would be monophasic sleepers, and that their sleep-wake patterns would be entrained to the light environments, and that they would show sleep homeostasis. I should also add, the reason that we're interested in this with lorises, particularly with the monophasic sleep, is because they're a basal primate species, so it can tell us a lot about that pathway. So first, we found, unsurprisingly, lorises perform nocturnal behavior, quite strict nocturnal behavior with a couple of brief activity bouts, but nothing that was strong enough to define as being activity of substance. Is more just little brief awakenings. And the photo on the side there is all that a loris does when they sleep. They tuck into a ball and they tuck their head in between their legs. Now, looking at the light environment, we found that they actually anticipated sunrise and sunset. So on the left here is the activity anticipation of sunrise, and on the right is to sunset. And we can see that they anticipated about an hour beforehand and started decreasing their activity. And this suggests both an intrinsic and also entrainment to their environment. But then we're also interested in temperature. And what this middle figure here is the temperature, the average temperature throughout the day and how it fluctuates. And on the right are what we call brief awakenings. And everyone has brief awakenings in their sleep. It's going to be these little blips that happen in between each of those sleep bouts that I mentioned, between when you have your non-REM REM group and then your next one, you have a brief awakening. And you can also have a brief awakening from disturbances in your sleep. So we can look at that in regards to sleep homeostasis. But if we look at the pattern of the ambient temperature and then the pattern of the brief awakenings, we can see there's quite a clear relationship there. So how do we decide if it's temperature related or if it's part of sleep homeostasis? It's a little hard to distinguish those in looking in wild populations. And move this, is that in the way? So in considering if lorises accumulate sleep pressure similar to humans, coming back to this image of sleep homeostasis, we decided to look actually at the disruptions in sleep and also torpor in relation to sleep. So what we did was we looked at napping, and we found that lorises indeed would take naps after torpor bouts, but it would be later in their activity pattern. So that suggests that there might be some aspect of sleep homeostasis going on there. Okay, is there a clock anywhere actually? Okay, cool, great. So now considering lemurs. So as I mentioned earlier, lemurs have these different activity patterns, so they're quite a good model for looking at sleep in this sense. And we focus on a nocturnal and also a cathemeral species of lemur for this research. So we compared the woolly lemur and also the nocturnal sported lemur. And we hypothesized that the woolly lemur, which is the cathemeral species, would show a shorter sleep duration and a slightly polyphasic pattern compared to the sported lemur. And that also the woolly lemur would have a more consolidated sleep. And consolidated means that there are going to be less of those brief awakenings that I mentioned. And also that the woolly lemur would have sleep-wake patterns that are less entrained to light environments since they're quite flexible in their activity patterns. So this research was done in collaboration with the Nocturnal Primate Research Group, particularly Giuseppe Donati, and also Tim Epley, and Margot Campo, and Michaela Balestri, and at their field site in Tsitsangambarika in Madagascar. And these two species are quite interesting, especially as Abahi meridionalis, which is a woolly lemur, is a more social species and is also, as I mentioned, ephemeral, but they have very similar ecologies. So it's actually very good for comparing how these activity patterns might be impacting their sleep patterns despite being in the same environment. So these are called actograms, and they can be quite a headache to look at. So I'll also explain how we analyze these. So it goes across in hours, and then each line is a day, and we're looking at activity. So the blue is going to be inactivity, and the yellow is activity. So on the left here, we have the ephemeral species, and on the right is the nocturnal species. So you can see there's a lot more noise in this figure here. And we use this to identify what their actual sleep-wake patterns are. And we can confirm that indeed the sportive lemur is quite nocturnal, as we expected, but not what we expected in terms of sleep durations. And the other interesting thing is, in terms of ephemeral, this actually isn't as noisy as we would expect. So we would expect there to be a lot more equal amounts of the yellow and the blue between the light and dark photoperiod. So it seems that Avahi meridionalis actually leans towards a more nocturnal side of ephemerality. And this is where ephemerality gets very complicated, because it's not really just a one-to-one. It seems even seasonally, they can fluctuate between being more towards nocturnal and more towards diurnal. And perhaps this is why no one's wanted to study their sleep in the wild. And also, when we looked at their consolidation, it seems that the woolly lemurs, again, the ephemeral species, wouldn't sleep for a single bout for longer than 80 minutes before they had a brief awakening. And I won't bore you too much with this not so pretty image, but basically we use survival curves in order to determine this. So it's similar to what you might use in medicine and seeing the survival rate. So we do that to distinguish the likeliness of something being sleep or not, and also the survival of a single sleep bout. And of course, I'd be happy to talk about the analyses further if anyone's interested in these. And then when we consider the sportive lemur, the woolly lemur, it says backwards. These bouts lasted for about 110 minutes before they were disrupted by a brief awakening. So it seems that the ephemeral lemurs actually have a more sustained sleep before it's interrupted. Okay. And then looking at their entrainment to light environment. So looking at both sunrise between the two, we have the sportive lemur on the left and then the ephemeral Avahi on the right. And it seems that the sportive lemurs would decrease their activity about 2 hours prior to sunrise. And then if we look at the woolly lemur, the ephemeral, it's much closer towards the light transitions. Now, if you look at this just with your eyes, you might think, oh, that's actually quite a stark contrast there, how they change their activity, but it's actually more about the anticipation of it. So we're more intrigued in how soon an animal begins to change in relation to the changes we see in the light. So the fact that Avahi waits till twilight's already been going on for a while before decreasing their activity suggests they might not be as entrained to the light environment. And then looking at transitions in sunset, the ephemeral woolly lemur has the peaks of activity actually in the astronomical twilight. Okay. So very briefly on this before I get into the human stuff. So basically, when we consider, again, Avahi, I realize I probably should just wrote ephemeral primates for you guys. So Avahi has more transition between this nocturnal ephemeral. Yeah.
I'm just curious if you think there's something functional about that increase in activity in the twilight period. Is there something about having some light but not all of the light that makes it a good time for them? Or do you have any hypotheses about that?
That's a good question. I don't really have a strong hypothesis about it. I do know that a lot of the research looking at activity patterns of lemurs find that many lemurs do seem to have increase of activity during the twilight, and it could have to do with being ecology. It could have to do with this uniqueness of lemurs and how the ecological niches are. Yeah, but yeah. And then also if we consider Avahi, there is this selection of the opsin genes for color vision that they hold, which is also what we find in diurnal primates. So maybe this has to do with this display in the transitions of the sleep patterns. Okay. Also, I'm sorry if I went too fast with that. So now on to the second part of talking about my current research and looking at human sleep. So in the transition of lifestyles towards industrialization and particularly shifts from comparisons in small scale societies, we have found that circadian rhythms of humans are shifting. And a lot of this is due to this relationship. So you have more time spent indoors, and with that, you're going to have less exposure to natural light, but you're also going to have increased exposure to artificial lighting. And artificial lighting affects our circadian rhythms in the same way as natural lighting. So if you're inside at night, you turn a light on, the superchiasmatic nucleus that I mentioned earlier is going to register that as the same as natural light. And all of this leads to what we call an environmental buffer. So we're buffered against the changes in the ambient temperature and the light changes, and this confuses our circadian rhythms, and we can shift off into different directions. And we can get circadian disruption, which has a lot of health implications with that as well. So research on sleep in small-scale societies is really increasing, which is amazing. But a lot of the research has talked about this in comparison to Western industrialized societies. Now, there's a lot of complications with that because there's different cultural backgrounds, there are different geographical variations. So can we truly compare these two? And what we need to do now is look more within communities of the same social cultural background and see how they might adapt to variations in their environment. So the Orang Asli are the original people of Malaysia, and they consist of 19 sub-ethno-linguistic groups that all have different historic subsistence strategies. And each of these groups come from similar geographic areas. But the Orang Asli are going through many changes in acculturation, industrialization, and urbanization right now. And with those changes come aspects such as housing changes and also electricity. So we're seeing some groups start to incorporate solar electricity generators. And then on the far end of acculturation, we have people connected to electrical grid and also living in concrete houses and more intertwined with the market economy. So for this research, I was interested in understanding how the environmental buffer actually impacts humans in terms of market integration, focusing on these aspects of industrialization, particularly today I'll talk about housing and also artificial lighting and technology. So this research is done with the Orang Asli Health and Life-Based Project, and this is led by a couple of PIs, including Vivek Venkatraman, who's my main PI at Calgary, and also Tom Kraft at University of Utah, and Amanda Lea at Vanderbilt University, and Ian Wallace in New Mexico. And this project has been going on for about 2 years now, and what we're trying to do is to measure these different lifestyle factors to try to understand the impacts of these transitions on different aspects of health. And particularly for me, I'm looking at sleep for this. So I'm going to be talking about 4 main groups this time. We are getting a lot more data. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to analyze them for this talk. We just got it this week. But first, I'll talk about the Temiyar, the Samai, the Batek Non, and the Temuan. So I put these in order of acculturation as well for these villages. So the Temiyar are historically Swidden horticulturalists, as are the Samai. Well, the Semai are starting to incorporate a little bit more wage labor. And then the Batek Nong are probably different than what you've heard of. If you've read any of Kirk Endicott's stuff on the Batek Nong are intriguingly, although they're historically hunter-gatherers, they're one of the more acculturated groups in terms of timeline. So they've quite escalated into including palm oil and also wage labor. And these groups have variation as well in electricity. And then we have the Temuan. And the Temuan historically are small-scale agriculture and also fisheries. And this group is almost entirely integrated with the market economy now. So for this data, we gave out accelerometers, and this is done during health clinics. So we would go and provide clinics within communities that wanted health clinics. And at the end, we would give them an accelerometer, ask them to leave it on for up to 10 days, and then return back and collect it. And also we would ask them a lot of questionnaires, so including what their house type was, what kind of electricity they had, and also the different household items and sociocultural backgrounds. So from this data, we got quite a few accelerometers back. Sometimes they don't all come back, or something's really weird with the data. So in the end, we got quite a few between the 4 different ethno-linguistic groups. And this is basically what the data looks like when it's raw. Well, after you process the raw data, there's many steps to it. But this just shows an example of activity patterns that we see. And on the left here is a more acculturated group, and on the right, on the left here is a less acculturated, on the right is a more acculturated. And you can see actually how less variable this sleep is here on the left, and on the right, we start to see a little bit more variation going on there in terms of when an individual goes to bed. And also, I'll show better graphs in this, but I just get excited about these. We have individuals in this group are going to bed before midnight. And then we see on the right, you see more individuals starting to go to bed after midnight, much later in the day. So specifically considering circadian rhythms, we're always interested in the timing of sleep and how these respond to environmental changes. So considering the onset of sleep and the 4 main groups, the Temyar and the Semai actually went to bed earlier, before midnight, and then we found the Batek Nong and Temuan went to bed after midnight. It's not a huge difference, but it can have a lot of difference in sleep, just an hour or 2. And again, Temyar and Semai are oh, you're not seeing the same thing here that I'm seeing there.
Yeah, the grays don't work very well.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, so the Semai and the Temyar go to bed earlier than the Batek Nong and the Temuan. And again, these 2 groups are historically Swidden horticulturalists. And then when we look at sleep duration, again, you can see it on this one. So the Semai and the Temyar are sleeping longer. Also, I should add, in terms of timing of sleep, interestingly, all the groups wake up at the same time. So everyone's waking up between 6:30 and 7 a.m. So this is why we see this variation that happens in sleep duration in response to timing of sleep. Because you could think that someone could go to bed later, but then just wake up later and they'd have the same sleep duration, but that's not happening in these scenarios. And we could talk all about time allocation and work, then the other aspect that we find is looking at brief awakenings and disruptions of sleep is the most acculturated group with a lot more marked integration is having the lowest number of brief awakenings, which is not what we expected. So considering housing specifically, we find that the people sleeping in concrete houses are going to bed later And then because of that, they're getting less sleep, again, because we found that everyone's waking up at the same time. So these are pretty direct relationships happening there. And the reverse in traditional houses, there's not really much of a difference in the wooding houses we're finding. And that could be because of the way that they structure the building of the wooding houses, where there's quite a gap in between the pieces of wood. So you're getting some more light exposure and temperature coming in. And then if we look at electricity, first, I looked at all the different categories of electricity that we had. So remember I mentioned generators and also solar energy, and those had no influence. But if we looked at connecting to electrical grid, that had an impact on people's timing of sleep. And those connected to electrical grid went to bed later, which makes sense with the idea that artificial lighting can extend our day and our activities. And then they were getting less sleep because, again, waking up at the same time. So then considering household devices, cell phones and smartphones specifically had an impact on when individuals go to sleep. So if you had a smartphone, people were going to bed later, but televisions had no influence. And I'll talk about that in a second. I think that might be one of the most interesting things, because we all find that, yeah, I'm sure even in this room, there might be some people that find when they're watching TV at night, they go to bed a little bit later. And the flicker to televisions has been compared sometimes to fire. There's a lot of interesting ideas there. So bringing it back to these hypotheses that we had. So the later sleep onset was taking place with individuals that were in concrete housing with that environmental buffer, and individuals that were more integrated with the market economy. But then thinking about electronic devices, again, we didn't find anything with televisions. And this is where ethnography really comes into play. So with the interview questions, I started asking people a lot of different aspects about their sleep. I wish I had time to get really in detail with those. But with the television, I started noticing that there were a couple of nights where the generator was left on really late. So then I started asking people the next day, why did you guys have the generator on all night? And like, oh, so-and-so went to the market and they actually got a DVD. So we watched the movie last night. So the reason that we don't see variation is because the entire village gathers together to watch TV at night. So it's quite a social event, which I think is fascinating. So even if you have a household variation going on with market economy and say 2 households have TVs, everyone gathers together to watch TV. So there's still not much variation going on there. And we can also expect that that has to do with social ties too. So there's going to be a lot of social gatherings that are also going to impact sleep. And we see social gatherings tend to happen at night as well. And they occur with or without TV, but I think this is largely why we see no variation going on there. And we were half right with this hypothesis. And so people sleeping in concrete houses had a shorter sleep duration. And this kind of makes sense. We actually have 2 opposing hypotheses between anthropology and chronobiology with this idea. So chronobiologists think that with artificial lighting leads to shorter sleep duration. But if you look at some of the research that's been done, looking at small scale societies, specifically the research by Gandhi Yetish, and he found that small scale societies slept less than we do in Western society. So we have these 2 opposing ideas that need to be tested more. But this is probably due to the differences in the environmental buffering that's happening with the concrete housing and artificial lighting that tends to be intertwined with concrete housing. They're not entirely correlated, but there's a lot of similarities between individuals that have concrete housing and also artificial lighting. And then the least number of brief awakenings matches our expectations because, again, that buffer is going to prevent you from these disturbances you can experience during your sleep. Okay. So in general, we need to look more into this. So we find that market integration does seem to have, even on just the basic concept of structures of housing and amenities does have an impact on sleep and could play a very important role also in the relationships we see in terms of non-communicable diseases that seem to coincide with industrialization and market integration. And going further, so what I've been looking at and will continue to look at now is looking specifically at daytime light exposure that an individual has, and also the temperature variation inside of their sleeping environment, and then adding more surveys based on what I've seen this past summer to get more of an idea on sleep habits and culture that's taking place. And also events and how events might impact sleep. So thinking again about sleep homeostasis, some of the things that I observed this summer that we wouldn't have known just looking at the data without this is that the Temiyar and the Samai perform what's called a Sewang dance. And it's the photos on the right here. And these can be almost thought of as similar analyses to the torpor I talked about with horses, where it's an event that's happening at night, but it's a physically active event that's happening at night, and that's going to delay sleep as a group. So we want to look at those events and if that can impact sleep homeostasis or sleep patterns. And maybe what I think is the most interesting thing I found this summer is one village introduced pigs into the village, and just as pets. So I'm actually finding, looking at the data, that the fragmentation of sleep they have is almost identical to when mothers are breastfeeding. And when I asked about this, it's because the pigs cry. Like they scream in the middle of the night to ask for milk, and they feed them milk in these bottles, and they carry around, as you can see, like babies here. And I think that's going to have a huge impact. And fortunately, we do have data on the sleep patterns in this specific village before they had pigs, and also once they introduced the pigs. So I'm really looking forward to digging more into that data and seeing how that impacts it. Maybe we can think about questions about animal care and farming with sleep patterns. And then lastly, probably what people would be most interested in here is we're going to look at the physical activity of individuals in relation to sleep, and also looking at cardiometabolic health biomarkers and seeing how this could impact sleep. So a lot of these aspects have a bi-directional relationship with sleep. So particularly things like obesity and sleep are very bi-directional. So we want to look more into these aspects and see the more nuanced understanding of what is really influencing people's sleep patterns and habits as well. Okay. And thank you. Sorry, I threw a lot of random things there, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for such a great.
May I ask a question?
Questions. So, yeah.
So I'm interested in the polyphasic sleep and the relationship between the short burst and the long one. If you deprive them of short bursts, do they increase the long one, or vice versa? If you change the long one, do they sleep more frequently?
Interesting. So to make sure I understand this question right, do you mean in terms of non-REM sleep for depriving the short one, or?
Well, the next question might have to do with REM sleep.
Okay, cool.
But I'm just thinking polyphasic sleep, as I understand it, is you have a number of short bouts during the day.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Long
Yes.
bouts at night. And if you disrupt the short bouts, do they just try to get more short bouts, or do they get a longer bout? And can the longer bout compensate for a deficiency in the short bouts, or vice versa?
Right, that's a very good question. I'm not sure if anyone's actually looked at that with polyphasic sleep, but the idea behind polyphasic sleep is that you're actually increasing your vigilance throughout the day to avoid things like predation. So in theory, you would think that a polyphasic sleeper, if they're disrupted from sleep, they're just going to put it at another point in the day. It's not as constricted, so a little bit more flexible with sleep times.
But what you can do with a long bout, genetically, in terms of gene activation that's involved with sleep, in terms of the physiological mechanism, the homeostasis, what you can do with a long bout is different from a short bout. That's why I wonder
If you compensate or not.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Something like that.
That'd be really interesting. I feel like that could probably be easily done too with the time series analysis and just looking at them consecutively. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. But
How about exposure to microbes, pathogens, beneficial microbes or not? How does that play in at all, either in anything that you have done or anything that you're thinking about doing in the future? Because there's some hypotheses about the function of sleep, that part of it is helping to reduce pathogen load, and we
Right.
keep the immune system's more active when you're sleeping. So yeah, so just curious how that ties in for you.
yeah, also a great question. Well, not pathogens specifically, but one of the reasons I've been here is I've been training with Ben in the lab to look at cortisol. So I probably should have thrown that actually at the end. I'm interested in seeing how cortisol responds in relation to people's sleep quality and quantity. So one of the things I did last summer was collecting diurnal cortisol curves from people from saliva, and we're going to look at those and see if we see any variation going on. And also, you can use waking cortisol to understand the quality of someone's sleep. So, yeah.
Do you collect, so I know you mentioned sort of at the end that you're really interested in looking at like physical activity and things like cardiovascular disease or whatever, but do you collect, I guess, like more consistent health data on these individuals? Like, I guess, like what do you get from them? I know you mentioned there's like surveys and stuff that you ask them.
Right.
Do you keep track of like if they're sick or if they're,
Ooh, that's a good
Any-
question. Well, we don't, not specifically if they're sick, but the project is a longitudinal study. So in these health clinics, we also get blood biomarkers, and so we can get information on cardiometabolic disease risks from that. And we do ask questions about daily activity, but the watches that we use for measuring sleep also measure activity. So we can look at physical activity from that. So.
I wonder about their wage, because I was a farmer for a long time, their wage labor compared to their horticulture. I'm surprised the horticulturist sleeps so little. If it's physical labor outside. And then the wage labor, is it going to a call center or is it loading produce on trucks?
More the latter. So there's a lot more, or at least those specific villages, it's more that they're going and they're trading a lot of the things they're getting from their farms or their gardens, as they call them in these groups, and bring them over, and they trade them in the nearest city there. There was one individual that goes and works in like a tech company, but that was it. There's a lot of changes happening very rapidly as well. So a lot of the children now are starting to go to the city and work in the city, and then might come back on the weekends. So we're going to see a lot more changes happening there. But for the most part, it's things like produce and taking that over.
We have a question on Zoom from Virginia. Amazing work. Do children go to school at standard time? Might this affect when folks, especially moms, need to get up, and why there is similar awake time across these populations?
That's a good question. Not really. There is school a little bit. There's actually a lot of fear about school at the moment with a lot of these villages, and there were some incidents that happened in the past where now people don't feel very comfortable sending their kids to school, and it's maybe once or twice a week. So it doesn't explain the consistency of the waking time, but in interviews when I would ask people, do you have an alarm clock, try and figure out what wakes them up, everyone would kind of laugh at me and would say like, no, we wake up with the chickens. So they wake up with the chickens, and that's consistent in every group. Yeah.
I'm curious to hear whether there's any seasonal variation that you see. And particularly, I think on one of your pictures, I saw bed nets.
So what?
Bed nets? Do they
Yeah.
use bed nets there? And so for my work in Africa where people use bed nets, the main complaint is they don't want to use it because it's too hot and they don't sleep well when they have to use the bed net. So I'm kind of wondering whether there is variation, particularly during mosquito season where they sleep worse or different timings or more awakenings, etc.
That's a great question. So I do ask people if they use a mosquito net or not, and to get that. It's been pretty random who uses mosquito nets, and personally, when I was there, I didn't notice that it was too bad mosquitoes. And the way the houses are, they're not really inside the houses. So I'm not sure if we'll find any difference with that, but it's definitely something to look into. But one thing that has been reported in terms of heat is the concrete houses. So people do say, like, yeah, the concrete houses get way too hot at night. And they don't get that with the bamboo or the thatch houses as much because there's a lot more ventilation going on in there.
So,
Sorry, you're both right there.
so you mentioned that you're getting into cardiovascular outcomes. Well, a lot of people are finding that sleep actually plays a really important role in Alzheimer's dementia and mild cognitive impairment. Are you guys collecting any data on that or plan to?
So I just wrote a grant to look at cognitive performance in relation to sleep. We'll see if I get it. But I'd be happy to talk to you about that more. Yeah, I think it would be, it plays a huge role. And that also similarly seems to have a bi-directional effect where we're not really sure how much, what causes what. But we definitely know that with dementias, you see what's called sundowning happens a lot, where the sleep patterns really seem to shift later and later, kind of almost like an extreme version of what we see with the concrete houses, but it just kind of keeps going. Yeah. Yeah, hopefully. Yeah.
You indicated that most of the information about primate sleep comes from captive studies.
Mm-hmm.
There must be studies of the same species that have been studied both in the wild and in captivity. And in those cases, what's the degree of concordance findings?
So, well, with the solorises, we found that the sleep duration is much shorter in the wild than we thought it was in captivity. Yeah. So it's actually a little bit closer to towards the human number. So it's actually solorises will sleep for 9.5 to 10 hours in the wild. I do think that it still holds this idea that nocturnal and diurnal primates have different sleep durations, especially in regards to
you're controlling photo period in captivity.
Yeah, exactly. And they don't really need to do anything. They're being given food all day. The temperature is controlled, no predators. And sometimes the social systems aren't very well organized as well in captive environments, so there might not be a need for maintaining for much socializing, or they might have them oddly separated. But we're definitely lacking in haplorhines for that research in the wild. So
there haven't been any studies of the haplorhine in the wild?
Not with accelerometry. Actually, that's not true. There's a baboon study by Mike Croput, which is a great study, and they actually had an event where I believe it was a leopard attack, and they found that there wasn't sleep homeostasis in that case. They didn't try to compensate for that disruption. I think that probably has to do with sociality, and they're such a social species, they need to maintain those social bonds. So there's this kind of cost benefit of time in those cases. Be curious on those thoughts from a lot of people at some point. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. And and she has a little bit more time right now in case anybody has some questions for afterwards. But thank you all so much.